Hi girls, this is Miss Gaska. Today I'm going to go over English 2, Semester 1, Week 2, Activity 1.3, Exploring Cultural Identity. Our learning targets for this activity are to compare and contrast how a central idea of a text is developed in an informational text and a personal essay. So, in this activity, you will read an informational text and a personal essay to compare and contrast how the main idea is developed through the author's distinct voices. So I want to draw your attention to this spot on the side where it tells us that voice is the way a writer or speaker uses words and tone to express ideas, as well as the writer's persona or personality. So let's look at setting a purpose for reading, which in my opinion is the most important thing we need to pay attention to because it tells us what to look for while we are reading. First of all, it says to underline or highlight information that helps you define the concept of cultural identity. So anything that kind of helps us understand cultural identity, we're going to underline or highlight. We're going to circle unknown words and phrases, trying to determine the meaning by using context clues, word parts, or a dictionary. So let's go down to informational text. What is cultural identity? So remember, we're looking for anything that helps us define the concept of cultural identity. I'm going to read the first few paragraphs with you, and then I'm going to go down to the next activity, and it's up to you to read the rest and continue to annotate. So, children begin to develop a sense of identity as individuals and as members of groups from their earliest interactions with others. One of the most basic types of identity is ethnic identity, which entails an awareness of one's membership in a social group that has a common culture. The common culture may be marked by a shared language, history, geography, and frequently physical characteristics. So I'm going to highlight that they develop their sense of identity partially from their ethnic identity, which is talking about their social group that has a common shared culture. And that's often marked by these things: shared language, history, geography, and physical characteristics, but not always physical characteristics. So, I'm going to put on the side a little note just to summarize what I just highlighted. Ooh, that is not what I meant to do. So far, cultural identity is related to ethnic identity, shared language, history, geography, and sometimes appearance/characteristics. So that's our first part that gives us a little bit of information. So here we have the second paragraph, which I'm going to go over with you. Not all of these aspects need to be shared, however, for people to psychologically identify with a particular ethnic group. So even if you're not in the same ethnicity, you can psychologically identify with that group. So cultural identity is a broader term. People from multiple ethnic backgrounds may identify as belonging to the same culture. For example, in the Caribbean and South America, several ethnic groups may share a broader common Latin culture. Social groups existing within one nation may share a common language and broad cultural identity, but have distinct ethnic identities associated with a different language and history. Ethnic groups in the United States are examples of this. So basically, cultural identity is like a broad term that's used to apply to a broader group, whereas ethnic identity has to do with more of these things that we listed up here. So cultural identity can include ethnic identity, so this isn't entirely wrong, but it also encompasses more than just that. So cultural identity doesn't need all characteristics of ethnic identity. It can be more broad and include multiple ethnic backgrounds belonging to the same culture. So for instance, say that you are Cuban you belong to the ethnic identity of being Cuban, which is separate from being Guatemalan or Mexican or Dominican or, anything else. But on like a broader scale, you would identify as Latino or Latina. So the cultural identity would be like Latina, but the ethnic identity would be your specific group that you belong to. So I'm going to let you continue reading this and annotating it without my input, and we're going to go down to the next part. So here we have questions to answer, and I will assist you with those. The first one says, what is the purpose of beginning the selection with the individual's sense of identity and moving to shared webs of meaning? So think about how it moved from looking from things from a personal point of view, like an individual, but then it goes down and talks about the shared webs. How does that contribute to like the meaning of the text? Why did the author structure this text that way? Think about what culture is, and see if you see a parallel there. For number 2, it says, what is meant by the invisibility of one's own culture? And cite details from the text that help support your answer. So think about how some aspects of your culture are visible and some aspects are invisible. So what's it talking about when it says the invisibility of one's own culture? For number 3, it says, based on the information given in the text, explain the difference between cultural heritage and cultural inheritance. So you're going to want to go back and find those words, cultural heritage and cultural inheritance, and then explain what the difference between the two is. For number 4, it says, what's the meaning of stereotype in paragraph 8? So you need to go down to paragraph 8, find the word stereotype, and then analyze what it means in this context, okay? Paragraph 5 says, consider the author's uses of the word static and dynamic in paragraph 8 to explain the concept of cultural identity. What can the reader conclude about the author's point, and how does that relate to cultural identity? So look at where they use static and dynamic, and if you don't know what those words mean, you might want to look them up. But then consider how the author uses them to explain what cultural identity is, and then what can you conclude about that? In number 6, working from the text, it says, using the My Notes space, write an objective summary of each section of this text. How does each section contribute to the development of ideas about cultural identity? Be sure to note how ideas are developed and refined throughout the text. So you're going to go back, look at each section, not each paragraph, each section, and then write a summary of each of those sections, and then answer that question, how does that section contribute to the development of ideas about cultural identity? Number 7 is, what is your understanding of cultural identity based on this text? So after you read this text, what do you believe cultural identity is basically what this is asking you. Number 8 says, reflect on invisible aspects of your culture. What differences exist between you and your culture? So think about your own cultural background. Who you are, where you came from, like all the things that it was describing in that brief essay. And then think about what differences exist between you as an individual and what your culture does. For 9, it says, what are some examples of your culture? Explain how those aspects are dynamic. So, for example, you might want to describe something like the way that your culture dresses, or the type of food that your culture eats, or the kind of music your culture likes, or things like that. So our next thing to do is look at this section for setting a purpose for reading, and it says, underline or highlight information that helps you define the concept of cultural identity. So this is the same thing you did for the last one, you're just doing it again for this second reading. And you're also going to continue to do the same thing where you circle unknown words and phrases and then try to define them by using context clues, word parts, or a dictionary. So this is called ethnic hash. I'm going to read to you the first 2 paragraphs, and then I'm going to help you with the questions, but it's up to you to read the remainder of the piece and to continue to annotate it. So, recently, I was invited to a book party. The book was about pluralism. Bring an hors d'oeuvre representing your ethnic heritage, said the hostess, innocently enough. Her request threw me into a panic. Do I even have an ethnicity? I wondered. It was like suddenly discovering you might not have a belly button. I tell you, I had to go to the dictionary. What were the flavors, accents, and linguistic trills that were passed down to me over the ages? What were the habits, customs, and common traits of the social group by which I have been guided in life, and how do I cook them? So I want to point out right here some of these word connections. So we have hors d'oeuvre, which is a French term that refers to appetizers, so the small portions you get before your meal comes. I also wanted to talk about the word hash and what hash means. It's usually talking about like a bunch of different foods blended together and cooked, kind of like a casserole or something of that sort. So here, recently, we have the word pluralism, which you guys may not be familiar with, but it's defined here for you on the side. It's the state in which people of different backgrounds live in society together, but hold on to their unique traditions and customs. So she says ethnicity. You guys probably know what ethnicity is. And then flavors, accents, and linguistics, so related to language. And you may not know trills, so I'm going to circle that too. And so I wanted to point out that she started to panic when she had when she was asked what her ethnic heritage was, basically. And so here are some of the things that she defines as like things that she wanted to find out about to identify like what her cultural identity was. So flavors, accents, linguistic trills, habits, customs, common traits. So those are some of the things that she's using to define cultural identity. I'm going to change the color of this because it kind of blends in with my red circles. There we go. So my last name is presumably Welsh from a, my last name is from a presumably Welsh plantation owner. My mother chose my first name from a dictionary of girls' names. It didn't sound like Edna or Myrtle, she said, as though that explains anything. I have two, mostly Cherokee grandparents. There's a Scottish great-grandfather, a French-Canadian great-uncle, and a bunch of other relations no one ever talks about. Not one of them left recipes. Of course, the ancestors who had the most tangible influence on my place in the world were probably the West Africans, and I could tell you right off that I haven't the faintest idea of what they do for hors d'oeuvres in West Africa. Although I have this Senegalese friend who actually serves the loveliest, poofiest little fish mousse things and puff pastries that look, well, totally French. So here, one of the things that she seeks to try to define her cultural identity so that she can make this recipe is her last name origin. So she says her last name is presumably Welsh. So she's talking here about like her country of her family's origin. Then she says that as far as like her ethnic background, she has Cherokee grandparents, she has a Scottish side, she has French Canadian, so she's talking about all the countries that make up her ethnic background, but none of them left recipes for her to use. And then she says the one that had the most tangible influence on her place in the world were West Africans. And then she also is talking about how she doesn't know what they're doing for hors d'oeuvres there, but her Senegalese friend makes a nice dish. So I wanted to circle words that you might not understand. I don't know if you guys know the word presumably. We also have tangible. You may not know that word. You might not understand faintest in this context. And then, I don't know if you know... I think that's pretty much it. So here she's talking about like her different ethnic heritages, but she's not really going much into her culture except West Africa kind of gave her like the closest thing to her place in the world, or her understanding of her place in the world. So you'll notice that she's talking about ethnic hash, like she's mixed of a bunch of different things, just like the food hash is mixed of a bunch of different foods. So she's also supposed to bring a recipe to this party. So on one hand, she's using recipe as like a literal sense, like I have to have a recipe from my ethnic background. But on the other hand, she's comparing herself to the dish that she's bringing, because just like that dish in particular would be mixed with a bunch of different foods from different backgrounds, she is also mixed of a bunch of different foods with different backgrounds. So it's a bit of a metaphor. So let's go down and look at the questions, and we'll see what we could do with them. So don't forget to do the rest of this essay and annotate. And then once you get down to number 10, it says, what does the metaphorical title suggest about William's cultural identity? So think about what I just said about her. She had to bring the food on the literal sense, but she's comparing the food to something on the more metaphorical sense. And then explain how that suggests her cultural identity. For number 11, it says, what do you think the term mulata means based on the way the author uses it in paragraph 3? So you're going to have to go back to paragraph 3 and find the word mulata, and then explain what you think it means based on the author's usage. For number 12, it says, how does the author use food to develop her ideas about ethnicity? So think about what I was explaining before about the different kinds of foods and how she's using it to compare it to herself, and then explain how she uses that to develop her ideas. For the next part, we have language and writer's craft, formal and informal voice. So formal and informal voice are both effective and correct, but they're used in different situations. So whenever you're writing something for an academic purpose, you're going to want to use formal academic voice. So that's when your main points are introduced in a logical order with obvious transitions, uses limited emotion, and depicts competence and expertise. It avoids contractions, abbreviations, and slang. Arguments are supported by evidence. Longer and more complex sentences are preferred, and may contain technical language and cited facts or statistics. So, it may seem like overkill, but I'm going to color code. So this one, I'm gonna call it light pink. Uses limited emotion and depicts confidence and expertise. Hold on. I'm gonna make this light pink too because it goes along with the first part. This one, I'm going to make it light blue. And then I'm gonna make this one match it. Properties, light blue. And then avoids contractions, abbreviations, and slang. I'm gonna make that one light green. Arguments are supported by evidence. It's kind of looking like Easter up in this paragraph. And I'm going to make that one be a darker blue. Or like kind of a medium blue. And then longer and more complex sentences are preferred. Let's make this one a red. And then it may contain technical language and cited facts or statistics. I'm just going to leave that one yellow. Okay, so now let's look at this paragraph and show which part is which. So it needs to have clearly introduced in logical order with obvious transitions. Children begin to develop a sense of identity as individuals and as members of groups from their earliest interactions with others. I think that's like the main point that they're stating, so that's the main point. It's clearly introduced in logical order with obvious transitions. So I'm going to highlight that in my pink. But it's also a quote, so it's also considered the part where it says supported with evidence. So properties. And then it says one of the most basic types of identity is ethnic identity, which entails an awareness of one's membership in a social group that has a common culture. So here, that's probably the best example of uses limited emotion and depicts confidence and expertise. And then I'm going to make that one light blue. And you don't have to actually do this color coding. I just wanted to really show you how each piece is used here. And it says the common culture may be marked by a shared language. Oh, whoops. History, geography, and frequently physical characteristics. And then it has a citation at the end. So I'm going to say arguments are supported by evidence. And that's it. And some of these other things were also appearing in this paragraph, but we can only mark so much, so. Let's look at the next one. It says informal voice. Similar to spoken conversation in structure, it displays emotions and acknowledges difficulty of subject. It may use contractions, abbreviations, or slang. Arguments are supported by personal example and may use short and simple sentences. Vocabulary is conversational more than technical. So I just wanted to highlight some examples of these things throughout this. So it says my last name, so it's talking about themselves from a first person point of view, meaning like they're talking using my, I, your, etc. So my mother chose my first name from a list of contractions. And then here she uses kind of an informal thing as though that explains anything. It sounds kind of like conversation, like the first part says. And then she also says, I can tell you right off, so that also sounds like conversation. And she's giving personal examples. She's talking about her friend who is Senegalese. So here you could tell that the style is informal, whereas the previous one was more formal. So for practice, referencing the characteristics of formal and informal voice, and use the My Note space to notate the characteristics of formal voice found in the first example and the characteristics of informal voice found in the second example. Then choose one of the above examples and then write it in the opposite voice. So we've already kind of identified the characteristics of each of those, so you just have to choose one of the examples and then rewrite it using the opposite voice. Then, come down, we have a Check Your Understanding section, which wants us to create a Venn diagram to compare and contrast the two passages in this activity. So what does each text say about cultural identity? And how does each text convey that message? Now, you don't have a reader-writer notebook, so I'm going to upload a separate file for you to do your Venn diagram on, and that should make things a little bit easier for you to complete that activity. And then you have to answer this question, what does each text say about cultural identity and how does the text convey that message? Last but not least, the writing to sources portion. Using your notes as the basis of an essay that examines the similarities and differences between the formation of cultural identity as analyzed by academics and as experienced by individuals. Okay, so you're comparing how cultural identity is analyzed and how it's experienced. So make sure that you're doing these things. Use a formal academic voice to examine the issues. Begin with a clear thesis that states your position. Include clear transitions between points and include a concluding statement. Effectively incorporate multiple direct quotations from both texts, introducing and punctuating them correctly. So for this essay, I'm going to say that you only need 4 paragraphs. One is the introduction, 2 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. Just make sure that you hit all of these things within your essay. That's all for activity 1.3. If you have any questions concerning this, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.